where two tides meet. I had complete faith in Dollmann, and I suppose I decided that I should be a fool not to take a good chance. I hesitated, I know, but in the end I nodded, and held up my arm as she forged ahead again. Soon after she shifted her course and I followed. You asked me once if I ever took a pilot. That was the only time. He spoke with bitter gravity, flung himself back, and felt his dramatic pause, but it certainly was one. I had a glimpse of still another Davies, a Davies 5 years older, throbbing with deep emotions, scorn, passion, and a stubborn purpose. A being above my plane, of sterner stuff, wider scope. Intense as my interest had become, while he mechanically rammed tobacco into his pipe and struck ineffectual matches. I felt that whatever the riddle to be solved, it was no mean one. He repressed himself with an effort, half rose, and made his circular glance at the clock, barometer, and skylight, and then resumed. We soon came to what I know must be the beginning of the Telte Channel. All round you could hear the breakers on the sands, though it was too thick to see them yet. As the water shoaled, the sea, of course, got shorter and steeper. There was more wind, a whole gale, I should say. I kept dead in the wake of the Medusa, but to my disgust I found she was gaining on me very fast. Of course I had taken for granted, when he said he would lead me in, that he would slow down and keep close to me. He could easily have done so by getting his men up to check his sheets or drop his peak. Instead of that he was busting on for all he was worth. Once, in a rain squall, I lost sight of him altogether, got him faintly again, but had enough to do with my own tiller not to want to be peering through the scud after a runaway pilot. I was all right so far, but we were fast approaching the worst part of the whole passage, where the Hohenhörn bank blocks the road and the channel divides. I don't know what it looks like to you on the chart, perhaps fairly simple because you can follow the twists of the channel as on a ground plan, but a stranger coming to a place like that, where there are no buoys, mind you, can tell you nothing certain by the eye, unless perhaps at dead low water, when the banks are high and dry and in very clear weather. He must trust to the lead and the compass, and feel his way step by step. I knew perfectly well that what I should soon see would be a wall of surf stretching right across and on both sides. To feel one's way in that sort of weather is impossible. You must know your way, or else have a pilot. I had one, but he was playing his own game. With a second hand on board to steer while I conned, I should have felt less of an ass. As it was, I knew I ought to be facing the music in the offing, and cursed myself for having broken my rule and gone blundering into this confounded short-cut. It was giving myself away, doing just the very thing that you can't do in single-handed sailing. By the time I realised the danger it was far too late to turn and hammer out to the open. I was deep in the bottleneck bight of the sands, jammed on a lee shore, and a strong flood tide sweeping me on. That tide, by the way, gave just the ghost of a chance. I had the hours in my head and knew it was about 2/3 flood, with 2 hours more of rising water. That meant the banks would be all covering when I reached them, and harder than ever to locate, but it also meant that I might float over the worst of them if I hit off a lucky place. Davies thumped the table in disgust. Pah! It makes me sick to think of having to trust to an accident like that, like a lubberly cockney out for a boozy bank holiday sail. Well, just as I foresaw, the wall of the surf appeared clean across the horizon, and curling back to shut me in, booming like thunder. When I last saw the Medusa, she seemed to be charging it like a horse at a fence, and I took a rough bearing of her position by a hurried glance at the compass. At that very moment I thought she seemed to luff and show some of her broadside, but a squall blotted her out, and gave me hell with the tiller. After that she was lost in the white mist that hung over the line of the breakers. I kept on my bearing as well as I could, but I was already out of the channel. I knew that by the look of the water, and as we neared the bank I saw it was all awash and without the vestige of an opening. I was going to chuck her onto it without an effort, so, more by instinct than with any particular hope, I put the helm down, meaning to work her along the edge on the chance of spotting a way over. She was buried at once by the beam sea, and the jib flew to blazes, but the reefed staysail stood. She recovered gamely, and I held on, though I knew it could only be for a few minutes, as the centre plate was up, and she made frightful leeway towards the bank. I was half blinded by scud, and suddenly I noticed what looked like a gap behind a spit which curled out right ahead. I luffed still more to clear this spit, but she couldn't weather it. Before you could say knife, she was driving across it, bumped heavily, bucked forward again, bumped again, and ripped on in deeper water. I can't describe the next few minutes. I was in some sort of channel, but a very narrow one, and the sea broke everywhere. I hadn't proper command either, for the rudder had crocked up somehow at the last bump. I was like a drunken man running for his life down a dark alley, barking himself at every corner. I couldn't last long, and finally we went crash onto something and stopped there, grinding and banging. So ended that little trip under a pilot. Well, it was like this. There was really no danger. I opened my eyes at the characteristic phrase. I mean, the lucky stumble into a channel was my salvation. Since then I had struggled through a mile of sands, all of which lay behind me, like a breakwater against the gale. They were covered, of course, and seething like soapsuds, but the force of the sea was deadened. The Dulce was bumping, but not too heavily. It was nearing high tide, and at half ebb she would be dry and high. In the ordinary way I should have run out a kedge with the dinghy, and at the next high water sailed farther in and anchored where I could lie afloat. The trouble was now that my hand was hurt and my dinghy stove in, not to mention the rudder business. It was the first bump on the outer edge that did the damage. There was a heavy swell there, and when we struck, the dinghy, which was towing astern, came home on her painter and down with a crash on the yacht's weather quarter. I stuck out one hand to ward it off and got it nipped on the gunwale. She was badly stove in and useless, so I couldn't run out the kedge. This was Greek to me, but I let him go on. And for the present my hand was too painful even to stow the boom and sails, which were whipping and racketing about anyhow. There was the rudder too to be mended, and we were several miles from the nearest land. Of course, if the wind fell, it was all easy enough, but if it held or increased, I was a poor lookout. There's a limit to strain of that sort, and other things might have happened. In fact, it was precious lucky that Bartels turned up. His galliot was at anchor a mile away, up a branch of the channel. In a clear between squalls he saw us, and like a brick, rowed his boat out. He and his boy, and a devil of a pull they must have had. I was clear enough to see them. No, that's not true. I was in such a fury of disgust and shame that I believe I should have been idiot enough to say I didn't want help, if he hadn't just nipped on board and started work. He's a terror to work, that little mouse of a chap. In half an hour he had stowed the sails, unshackled the big anchor, ran out 50 fathoms of warp, and hauled her off there and then into deep water. Then they towed her up the channel. It was dead to leeward, and an easy job, and berthed her near their own vessel. It was dark by that time, so I gave them a drink, and said good night. It blew a howling gale that night, but the place was safe enough, with a good ground tackle. The whole affair was over, and after supper I thought hard about it all. End of chapter 7. Recorded by Gesine in June 2007.